The moon has always fascinated us. Civilizations have looked upon it for thousands of years, wondering what it could be and what power it might hold. Countless myths, legends, and entire religions have been built around the moon. There are also many conspiracy theories surrounding our celestial companion, one being the hollow moon theory. This theory suggests that the moon is not solid, but rather hollow, and that it was constructed or inhabited by aliens and could be a giant spaceship or space station used to spy on Earth. In Zulu mythology, they believe the moon was brought here many years ago. According to this legend, the climate of the Earth was very different. There were no seasons, and a blanket of thick water vapor covered the entire planet. They believe that two brothers stole an egg from a dragon, emptied it out to make it hollow, and placed it into the sky. When they did this, all the water vapor fell at once and resulted in a cataclysmic flood. Credo Mutwa, a prominent Zulu traditional healer and storyteller, believed in the existence of a reptilian race, or Chitori, that stole the moon and hollowed it out so that they could oversee Earth from a headquarters to monitor and manipulate humans. There are many other ancient stories that talk about a sky before the moon arrived, and these ancient cultures made connections between the moon, the tides, and the seasons, hundreds of years before science confirmed it. Despite it being humanity's constant companion through all recorded time, the moon is still a mystery that science hasn't yet been able to explain. The first clues about the moon's formation came from the Apollo 11 mission, when the first astronauts visited the moon. They wanted to find out how it was formed, what it was made of, and whether it could be more habitable. To find out more about the moon's structure and activity, they left behind seismographic measuring systems known as ALSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, on the moon. These instruments would record moonquakes and meteor impacts, as well as measure the moon's magnetic field to see if the moon had a molten core like the Earth. The astronauts brought back about 21.6 kilograms of lunar rock and soil called regolith. However, when these moon rocks were analyzed, it only created more questions. The rock samples were mainly basaltic rocks, which are rocks solidified from molten lava. Prior to the moon landing, scientists believed that the moon has always been a cold body. The discovery of basalt disproved this. The samples also contained no water and provided no evidence for living organisms at any time in the moon's history. They also carried the same isotopic ratios as the Earth, suggesting that they shared a common origin. The moon doesn't have a magnetic field like Earth, yet the moon rocks brought back from Apollo 11 were strongly magnetized. They believe this is because during the moon's early formation, it did have a magnetic field, likely created by a molten core like Earth's. Rocks formed during this time got magnetized, but as the moon cooled down and its core solidified, it lost its magnetic field, and somehow the moon rocks still held on to that magnetization. Less than 4 months after the success of Apollo 11, NASA launched Apollo 12, its second manned mission to the moon. The main objective of this mission was to find out more about what's below the surface of the moon by creating large shock waves on the surface. They left more seismometers on the moon's surface to see how the moon would behave and what resonances would happen during an impact. After the ascent module had safely returned the crew from the lunar surface to the command module, it was intentionally crashed into the moon's surface. It hit the moon at a speed of almost 3,800 miles per hour with a force of 1 ton of TNT, creating a 30-foot wide crater. The impact produced seismic data that surprised scientists on Earth. Instead of the expected signal, it appeared as though the moon was resonating like a ringing bell, with oscillations lasting for an hour. This puzzled scientists because such a phenomenon could only occur if there were substantial empty spaces inside the moon, allowing sound waves to reverberate freely. While the Apollo 13 astronauts famously used their ascent module as a lifeboat to get back to Earth, Apollo 14's ascent module, which was much heavier than Apollo 12's, was also intentionally crashed into the moon. This time, the moon rang like a gong for over 3 hours, with vibrations traveling to a depth of 20 miles. The same was done with Apollo 15, 16, and 17. All these impacts were picked up by the seismic detectors which had been left by the current and previous missions. The results that were sent back to NASA confirmed the moon's lower density. The detectors continued to work up until 1977, when they were switched off by NASA 5 years after the landing of Apollo 17. In that time, they had picked up more seismic activity than was anticipated, with some of the moonquakes measuring up to 5.5 on the Richter scale and resonating up to 700 kilometers below the surface. The observation that the moon was far less dense than originally thought prompted some people to speculate that the moon could even be hollow, suggesting an artificial origin. This contradicts everything we know about physics. Even Carl Sagan stated that a natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. Since this is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, some began to wonder if the moon was deliberately interfered with and used as a covert operation base by beings far superior to humans. The moon has a lot of characteristics that we don't see anywhere else. The intricate balance between the Earth and the moon is a relationship that has not been duplicated anywhere else in our solar system or throughout our observable galaxy. Supporters of the hollow moon theory thought it was remarkable that the moon seemed to be a perfect size at the perfect distance to the Earth, so that its disk would exactly cover the sun during a solar eclipse. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun and is coincidentally 400 times closer to the Earth. This is why we can experience solar eclipses. The chance of this happening is so astronomically small, seeing as other moons are relatively much smaller in comparison to their home planets. Our moon not only orbits much closer than it should, but it is also the only object ever observed to have a near perfectly circular orbit. Astronomers have pointed out that the angular diameters of the sun and moon vary over time by several percentages, making solar eclipses not all equal or perfect. The moon is constantly moving away from Earth at a rate of 3.8 centimeters per year, so eclipses are becoming less and less perfect and one day will no longer be possible. The surface of the moon is scarred with tens of thousands of impact craters of various sizes. The most interesting thing about these craters is that even though some of them are very large and others are very small, they all seem to have the same depth. Some believe this is because there's an interior protective plate or metal shell that lies just beneath the surface, an artificial structure that's keeping asteroids and meteors from penetrating any deeper. Titanium is rare on Earth but is found in abundance on the moon. It's one of the strongest metals that are known to exist and is highly resistant to corrosion. If you were an alien race wanting to enforce a structure, this is the perfect metal to use. The actual scientific reason for why moon craters all seem to be the same depth no matter how big or small is because of how impacts work on the moon. The moon's surface is like a layer of loose rocks and soil called regolith. When something crashes into it, the energy from the impact creates a crater by digging into the regolith. The consistent depth of the craters comes from the way this energy spreads out, sort of like ripples when you drop a pebble into water. On Earth, the newest rocks are at the surface, and the rocks get older as you go deeper. On the moon, however, it's backwards. The soil and rocks on the surface are older than the soil and rock underneath. The only way this happens on Earth is when we drill, dig and mine, bringing older material to the surface. If the moon was artificially hollowed out, this would be an explanation for why older rocks would be on top. The actual explanation for this is that the moon is a relatively inactive body compared to Earth and doesn't experience the constant reshaping and recycling of its surface. Instead, the moon's primary sculpture is impacts from meteoroids and asteroids. Each impact digs into the moon's surface, bringing older rocks to the top and covering them with a layer of lighter regolith. Over time, the regolith accumulates on the surface, burying older rocks beneath it. This is why the moon lacks the distinct layered structure of rocks. The moon's surface is made predominantly of basaltic rock, solidified from molten lava. Although it is a very lightweight rock, it also absorbs impact extremely well, so it wouldn't be expected to reverberate, but waves of energy that occur during a moonquake act very differently to how they do on Earth during an earthquake. Vibrations on the moon last far longer than equivalent vibrations on Earth, so even if a moonquake isn't intense, the resonance just keeps on going. As for the observation made by NASA, where the moon rang like a bell, this phrase was simply a metaphor, meaning that the vibrations on the moon lasted much longer, like the resonances of a bell. The actual reason for these resonances is that the moon is dry, with very little water content compared to the Earth. The Earth is a water-rich planet, with water covering about 71% of its surface, with even more water buried deep inside the Earth's mantle. All this water has a dampening effect on rocks, so when earthquakes happen, the water in the Earth absorbs that signal very quickly. But on the moon, there's much less water on the surface and even less water in the interior, so there's not much to dampen the vibrations. Where the same impact would only last 2 minutes on Earth, it would last 10 minutes on the moon. The water content is also not evenly distributed and exists in the form of ice in permanently shadowed craters near the Moon's poles. These areas receive little to no sunlight, allowing the water ice to persist despite the harsh conditions of the Moon. The Moon is 27% of the Earth's size, but only 1% of the Earth's mass. So the Moon is not hollow, but it is far less dense with a much smaller core than the Earth. Lunar rock samples and Earth rock samples have isotopic ratios that are identical, showing that they have a common origin, and therefore the Moon is not a foreign object or an alien habitat. The fact that science is not yet totally sure on exactly how or when the Moon formed is perhaps a reason why alternate Moon theories still continuously appear. The most credible Moon formation theory to date is known as the giant impact hypothesis, stating that the Moon most likely came about as a byproduct after another planet crashed into Earth. Learn more about the Moon's origin and history by clicking on this video.